may be seated. And now to bring us the sermon, Mr. Scott Lloyd.
Thank you again, Mr. Godfrey. I had this thing about socks. Some of you know that. Okay, I did not mean to do that. I just set my Bible there, and I think I tripped the light. Anyhow, so a couple of weeks back, Matthew Leschke, I'm not sure whether it was Matthew or all the kids. I think it was all the kids, but Matthew's the one who gave them to me. Gave me the socks that I'm wearing today, so I'll show you really quickly. There's not much to see. They're a bunch of baby Yodas. So for those of you who know Star Wars, you will know immediately what it was. Well, today, Allie gave me a pair of Snoopy socks. So there's a picture of Snoopy sleeping on top of the world. So I remember the feast in Tucson 2 years ago. Mr. Register is also an aficionado of fancy socks. He loves cactus socks, and everywhere he goes, he buys socks. Well, so he went and he bought this really loud pair of hot chili pepper socks for Mr. Franks, who was also there at the feast. Mr. Franks said, well, there are two kinds of people in the world, those who know how to dress and those who don't. He said, and those people who know how to dress wear plain black socks. So the rest of us who like some kind of socks besides plain black, but I guess don't know how to dress. But at least that was the joke that went on during the course of the feast. I have here in my pocket a knight. You probably can't see it because it's so tiny. This is a knight with action arm. I don't know if you can see that. When you push down his arm, his little sword goes swinging up. This actually is just a Fisher-Price toy from a castle set that we have that was Alex's when he was a little guy. Well, we have little guy and a little girl at the house this week, so of course we got these out. And what I was talking about today was a group of knights. And so I saw one of these. I said, I got to get one and use it as a prop. A long time ago, I was blessed with a history teacher when I was in 6th grade. Mr. Scott was always a guy who said, I don't care if you know when something happened, you just need to know why it happened and why it's important. You can always look up the when. So when it comes to history, if you understand nothing else about history than to know why this happened and why it's important and what the effects of that thing were, then you can always go back and look at the date. On November 27th, 1095, so you can do the math, subtract 2022 minus 1095, however many years ago that was. I guess I could do that, but I don't have any paper with me, so all right, let's see how my math skills are coming along. 2022 minus 1095. Carry the 1. So 900 and some odd years ago? 927? 1027. 1,027 years ago, Pope Urban, the Pope of the Catholic Church, gave an address to a council in Clermont, France. And what he said changed the world of knights, the world of Europe. According to historians, the call to action that Pope Urban II the call to action that he gave set in motion the wheels that brought an end to the Middle Ages. Medieval times, castles, moats, fortresses, knights, everything else like that were brought to an end because of what Pope Urban said. You see, on November 27th, 1095, Pope Urban called on the European nobles to make a journey or a crusade to rid the Holy Land of the Muslims. He called for the Crusades. And what happened is, for the next 200 years, as many as 60,000 and possibly as many as 130,000 Europeans left Germany, England, France, Italy, and so on, and journeyed all the way to Jerusalem to rid the Holy Land of the infidels. One of the groups that traveled were called the Knights of the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. The Knights of the Order of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem. They were also known as the Knights of Rhodes. Many years later, they became known as the Knights of Malta, and they are recognized, and you'll see this emblem on their shields, the Malta Cross. The Malta Cross was the emblem of the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Hospitaller were the first ones to create hospitals to care for the wounded and the sick. They're credited with building the first hostels. If you ever traveled to Europe, if you're ever a college student or anything else like that, and you travel, you stayed at hostels, which are a form of the word hospital, believe it or not. So they were credited with building the first hostels, which were stayover places for people who were traveling to Jerusalem. They're credited with building the first hospitals along the way. One of the most interesting things about this group is they all swore to a creed. To be a member of that order, you had to agree to live by Romans chapter 12, verses 10 through 13. Romans chapter 12, verses 10 through 13 is the creed of the Knights of Malta, the Knights Hospitaller. Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 10. Romans chapter 12, verse 10 says, "Be kindly affectioned towards one another with brotherly love." Philadelphia. In honor, giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer, distributing to the needs of the saints, given to hospitality. The word given means addicted. It's the same thing as somebody who's given to wine. It means to be addicted to it. So these people are addicted. They swore to be a part of this order. They swore to be addicted to hospitality. It is that word, hospitality, that I would like to discuss today. The Greek word translated hospitality is the word philoxenia. Philo meaning love, xenia, which means stranger. Xenophobia is the fear of strangers. Philoxenia is the love of strangers. So it's to love strangers, to show kindness to people you don't know well. That's what hospitality is. Philoxenia. The title of my sermon is Philoxenia. You could also just cross that out and write the word hospitality, same word, except philoxenia is the Greek, hospitality is what we know it in English. So today what I would like to do is I'd like to look at God's word for instruction regarding the practice of hospitality. We'll look at what it is. We'll look at what it's not. We'll dispel some of the myths about it. We'll look at examples both in the scriptures and in people's lives. And lastly, we'll look and ask and answer the question, why on earth does God command us to practice hospitality? Point number one, what is hospitality? What is it? If we're commanded to do it, we need to know what it is. We're given to hospitality is what it says. As I said, the Greek word for hospitality is philoxenia, which means the love of strangers. According to the Encyclopedia Biblical Life, at the time the New Testament was written, in the Roman world, there was actually a part of each Roman villa called the hospitalis. The hospitalis was a special part of the villa that was set apart for guests. What do we call them today? A guest room, right? How many of you, out of curiosity, have a guest room in your home? Okay. It may be the basement. It may be a bedroom. It may be a tent out in the backyard. But so you have a guest room, right? Well, in Roman villas, this was called the hospitalis. It's interesting. It says the hospitalis was a special building on a Roman estate that was specifically set aside for housing guests. There were specifically trained slaves who were assigned to it. The act of hospitality, serving guests, was the primary responsibility of the master of the house, but he could assign a slave to do it. That servant was responsible for seeing to the needs of the guests. Does that ring a bell? Jesus Christ was the primary host, the primary person responsible for the Passover service, and he could have deferred his foot washing responsibilities to any number of different servants, but he did it himself. It was his responsibility to see to it that his guests were taken care of, and he did that. So the word is used in one other place in the Bible. It's found in Hebrews chapter 13. Let's go there. So this is the word philoxenia. Hebrews chapter 13. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 1 tells us, let brotherly love continue. That sounds a lot like Romans 12. Let brotherly love continue. Verse 2, do not forget to entertain strangers. So what does it mean to entertain strangers? Do magic tricks? Put on a show? Sing and dance? Well, if that's what entertaining means, I am desperately in trouble because I don't do any of those things. Ask Monica. When we dance, we always slow dance because then the likelihood of me stomping on her feet is nil, right? So I don't sing and dance. So when it comes to entertaining, so the word entertain strangers means to show them a good time, to take care of their needs, to engage them, to talk to them, to spend time with them. So it says, let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers. The word entertain strangers in the Greek is philoxenia. For by so doing, some have unwittingly entertained angels. I can think of two examples right off the top of my head, and they're related. Abraham and Lot. They entertained angels. We'll look at that in a little while. The Expositor's Bible Commentary says this. It says, the writer is not advocating hospitality on the off chance that one might happen to receive an angel, but rather God is pleased when believers are hospitable. Sometimes unexpected happy results follow acts of hospitality. It was highly esteemed in the ancient world, and it was very important for Christians, as we'll see. So my mind immediately goes to Abraham and Lot, who entertained two angels. We'll look at that in just a second. There's another word that's used 3 times that is very, very similar to philoxenia, and it is the word philoxenos. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 3. 1 Timothy chapter 3. This is a discussion regarding the qualifications of an elder. There's a really cool book, if you ever get a chance to lay your hands on it. It's called The Measure of a Man by Gene Getz. And in his book, what he does is he describes, so we typically say these are the qualifications for an elder. But in his book, Mr. Getz makes the point that these really are the qualifications of a mature Christian. These should be what a mature Christian looks like. These attributes, which is what we expect of elders, to be mature Christians. So he says here in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, it says, "This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the office of a bishop or an overseer, he desires a good work. A bishop then, or an overseer, a mature Christian, must be blameless, above reproach, no glaring faults. Must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality." As mature Christians, we should have reached the point that we are given to hospitality, addicted to it. Goes on to say, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, and temperate. Sorry, my eye just went down to Titus, not Timothy. Let's go over to Titus. Titus chapter 1. Here again we see this list of qualifications of a mature Christian. Titus chapter 1, starting in verse 6. It says, "If a man is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly, a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon angry, not given to wine, not a striker, not given to filthy lucre, but a lover of hospitality." So as mature Christians, we're supposed to be lovers of the love of strangers, lovers of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, and temperate. Let's jump on over to 1 Peter for a moment. So we're looking at this idea about what hospitality is. Hospitality is a requirement for elders. Hospitality is to entertain strangers. 1 Peter chapter 4. First Peter chapter 4, verse 8 says, "And above all these things, have fervent love for one another." Well, Mr. Schultz encouraged us to remember that we're family. We have a responsibility to look after each other. Here we're told, have fervent love for each other. For love will cover a multitude of sins. You know, how is it that we are able to forgive people for being foolish and for saying silly things? You know, one of the things about being a pastor is I'm constantly putting my foot in my mouth. It goes with the territory. Proverbs says that in the multitude of words, there's no lack of sin. And I spend my lifetime, I make my living talking. And there are times when I say things it's really challenging. There are some people who want me to say things stronger, and there are some people who are offended because I say them too strongly. Having a discussion at the gym this week, one of the guys says, "You're a minister. Are you for or against gay marriage?" It's like, I said, I hope I answered correctly. I said, the Bible is clear what marriage should be. That marriage should be a union between a man and a woman. Well, the one guy said, well, that's good enough for me. It's like, So are you opposed to gay marriage? Well, I think he thinks I am opposed to gay marriage. The other guy who's sitting there who was in favor of gay marriage says, I said that the Bible is clear. So was I hedging my bets? I don't know. I spoke the truth. That's what the Bible says. And I'm on solid ground as long as I say that. If I go above and beyond that, that's when I offend people. Hospitality is to show kindness, to show love to strangers. It says, above all these things, have fervent love for one another as members of a family, for love will cover a multitude of sins. That's what makes us able to forgive each other. Please notice verse 9. It says, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. So what is hospitality? Hospitality is closely related to fellowship. It's to entertain strangers. It's to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked. It's to have people to your home and to take care of them. So hospitality is to show love to strangers, and it's to love the act of hosting others. Point number 2, what hospitality is not. Hospitality is not complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated. Typically the excuse people use for not having people to their home is, my home isn't big enough. I don't have nice enough furniture, or silver, or crystal, or china, or any of those other kind of things. I don't have the ability to host a lot of people at my home. Does that abrogate your responsibility to practice hospitality? What does God say? Practice hospitality. What if you can't have people to your home? Come up with a creative way to do it. It's okay to take somebody to lunch and pay the bill. What is that? Hospitality. It's taking care of the needs of others. It's okay to do that. Hospitality does not have to be complicated. I'll give you a few examples in a few minutes. Hospitality is not about the host. It's about the guests. It's not about the host. It's about the people that you have over. We have to ask ourselves, why are we doing it? The instructions in Scripture are not a suggestion. They're a command. One of the classes we had at Ambassador College was called Christian Leadership, and it was taught by Mr. Karn Catherwood. And one whole series of lectures, I think it was actually 2 lectures, was on hospitality. I'd like to read just a few excerpts from the class notes. God commands you to open your house and invite others over. It's not dependent upon your or your wife's abilities. She may hate cooking. If you hate it, you hate it. She may be a clinging vine who doesn't want to share you with other people. These, however, are not viable excuses. In the past 20 years, my wife and I have moved 19 times. One thing that we've learned is that a permanent fixture in our furniture is the dining room table. If you're recently married, I suggest you get 3 basic things: a bed, big enough for the both of you, a refrigerator, and a table. The bigger, the better. You must entertain others, and you must do it right away. And then he goes on to talk about other stuff, which I'll share some of in just a moment. When you invite people into your home, who are you trying to serve? If you're trying to impress them with your skills as a host, you're serving yourself. When you're serving them, you're serving God. When we serve others, we are serving God. He goes on to say, love is genuine, outgoing concern, and hospitality is showing love to others. True hospitality, which serves the visitor, must have this as its sole purpose. It can be done in one room. It can be done in a one-room hut I'll share stories about that in just a second. But it must be done not with the intent to impress somebody. It must be done for the purpose of giving them something. What? Enjoyment, refreshment, food. To have God's blessing upon your home, the home must have an open door. You must welcome people in, he says. Money has nothing to do with hospitality. The same bond can be built in a humble home as in a spectacular house. This applies whether you're single, married, or divorced. It is the spirit of hospitality that makes all the difference. Hospitality is not complicated. It can be simple. And hospitality, brethren, is commanded. At this point, I'd like to share a couple of examples. When I first came to church as a brand new bachelor, unmarried, constantly hungry, came to church back in Medford, Oregon. There was a man there by the name of Fred Short. He was 6'4". He had 7 children. He was a cabinet maker. He was a poor man. I do remember his real name was Durf Shmalu Trosh, which is Fred Williams Short backwards. We were in Spokesman Club together, so he would ask to be referred to as Durf occasionally instead of Fred. So anyway, Mr. Short would have you over to his house. We always had morning services in Medford, 10 to 12. So it was a perfect time to have people over. It's noon, people are hungry. So you go over to the Shorts' house for dinner. Whenever you went, you had the same thing. Whether it was this Sabbath, next Sabbath, 5 Sabbaths from now, it was always the same thing. Mrs. Short would make a huge pot of black beans. There would be piles and piles and piles of flour tortillas. There'd be sticks of butter and gallons of milk on the table. If you were going to the Shorts for Sabbath dinner, you had beans, tortillas, butter, and milk. And hours of scintillating conversation. That's what they could afford. That's how they entertained. When they had people over, that's what you got. There was one other lady in the congregation. I've shared this story before on limited times. Her name was Mrs. Dean. Mrs. Dean asked me either the second or third Sabbath I was at services. She came up to me and she said, "You're coming to my house next Sabbath for lunch." It wasn't even an ask. She told me I was coming. I said, "Okay." She said, "What do you not like?" You know where this is going, right? And I said, "Well, Mrs. Dean, I don't like tuna fish." She said, "Oh, okay." Next Sabbath, knock on her door. The door opens. This blue cloud of tuna smell comes blasting out the door, knocks me over. My eyes are watering. I'm coughing. It's like, okay, this is too much. So she invites me in. I'm there with my friend Manuel Betancourt. The two of us come in. She says, "Sit down, boys. Have some iced tea." She handed us an iced tea. You're sitting there. My eyes are still watering. It's like, oh, what am I going to do? She said, "We got more people coming. Just hang tight. As soon as they get here, we'll have lunch." Tuna noodle casserole? Is it, tuna loaf? Is it a tuna melt? I mean, I have to explain why I don't like tuna fish. When I lived in Japan, tuna fish and cat food came in the same cans. They looked alike. They smelled alike. They were the same size. To this day, I cannot disassociate tuna fish from cat food. Anyway, be that as it may, she waited until there were 10 or 12 other people in her living room. And then she said, she looked right at me. I'm looking at Perry right now. She looked right at me and said, "Now, you said something about tuna fish, but I don't remember whether you said you liked it or you didn't like it. Which was it?" And it's like, what do I say? I'm going to offend this little lady. The local elder is there, a bunch of these other people that I'm just starting to go to church with. And I said, well, I knew I had to be honest. So I said, "Mrs. Dean, I said, I don't care for tuna fish." She said, "I thought that's what you said. I opened a can and put it in the oven because we're having fried chicken outside." She had actually gone to the trouble of opening a can of tuna fish and putting it in the oven and making the house smell like tuna fish just for me. Then we went outside on her patio and had a wonderful lunch of fried chicken. Now, I told this story to Mr. David Johnson. We were at the conference in Texas or something like that. Mr. Johnson had been an associate pastor in Medford, Oregon before I was there. I told him this story, and he started to die. His eyes were watering. He said, that's exactly the way she was. She would get together the most unique collection of people to come to her home. She would take people that she knew really well and people that nobody knew and bring them together for a meal. And she made everybody feel welcome. So, those are two stories. Years and years and years ago at the feast in Cape Cod, I had the opportunity to work in the AC booth where I think we used to sell envoys. And I was working in this AC booth, and we finished cleaning up after services were over one day, got the cash box, and I had to take it to the business office. And I'm sitting there with a friend of mine. I think it was Eric Larison, a friend of mine. And we had everything done. And so we're waiting. I go and take the cash box back up, come back down, and this older gentleman comes over and starts talking with us. How you doing, boys? What's going on? Are you having a good feast? Are you enjoying college? What'd you think about the sermon? He wouldn't leave, and he just stuck around. And I say older, I mean, this was quite a few years ago, and he had to be at least 80. Now, I know some of you in this room are older than that. He said, are you guys hungry? Always. He said, I'd like to take you to lunch. So this gentleman, out of the clear blue, took two starving college students over to the King's Table, which was the finest restaurant in all of Cape Cod. Now, lunch prices were cheaper than dinner prices, but he took us over to the King's Table. We didn't eat lobster, but we had a phenomenal meal, and we sat there and we talked for hours. He practiced hospitality to two strangers. To this day, I still remember what he looked like, what we talked about, and it's like a little gold nugget that I have in my treasure chest, and every once in a while I pull it out and take a look at it. That special meal at the Feast of Tabernacles that this gentleman provided us, this act of love, this act of kindness, this act of taking care of strangers, still rings true today, and it will for the rest of my life. Till I die, throughout the rest of eternity. I'm looking forward someday to running into him again and taking him out for lunch. I told my good friend Phil Dick, that I was giving this sermon. Phil Dick worked over in Jordan for the project, and he taught at the Bunyat School, which was the school for we used to call them mentally retarded, the developmentally delayed. And in Jordan and in other parts of the world, those people who are handicapped in those ways are not treated nicely. So Phil was a teacher there. He taught PE. One of the janitors in that school struck up a friendship with Phil and invited him to his home. Phil said, I've never been to an Arab home. He said, I came in. There was no furniture, not a single stick of furniture. He said there was a mat on the floor, and on the floor there were 4 plates. There were a couple of dishes of food, he said, and this was the best they had, and they served him. He said, I don't know how, but they found out that I like pound cake. He said, and somewhere, somehow, in Amman, Jordan, they managed to find a pound cake. He said, I can't even imagine what they spent on a pound cake in Amman, Jordan, just for me. These people went to great lengths to show kindness to him. There's a Bedouin saying, the Bedouin people in the Middle East, when somebody comes that they're hosting, it's, you are among our family. That's what it means. I don't know the Arabic translation, but that's what it means. Mr. Catherwood, in his class, gave us 2 examples. I did want to share these with you. Years ago, I was in Chipley, Florida. I visited some members who lived 7 miles out into a swamp. They lived in an old house that was built on stilts in order to keep the floods and the snakes away. So they were right on the border of the Okefenokee Swamp. And he said the house was built on stilts in order to avoid the floods and the snakes. It had no windows or carpets. It had warped floorboards, and it looked to be about 80 years old and ready to fall over at any moment. This lecture was given in 1985, so the house was built back at the turn of the century, if so. It says the family could have been very self-conscious of this and not invited me over. That, however, never entered their minds. They said, "Come to dinner," and I did. They told me not to worry about the snakes because not too many ever made it up the stilts anymore. We had a nice meal of fresh tomatoes sprinkled with sea salt and fried okra. I was always warned to avoid fried okra. I tried it and loved it. Better him than me. I find fried okra to be really mushy, like meal, and it's like, anyway. He said, after the meal was over, we sat around and talked for hours, listening to the crickets. While I only got bitten by mosquitoes, I will always remember that very special evening. In the kingdom, I want to have this family over to give them the same enjoyable memories that they gave me. Think about opportunities that you have had to share hospitality. Point number 4. Let's go to Genesis chapter 18. So I talked about personal examples. I have one more that I can share. I better check the time. But Genesis chapter 18 is the example of Abraham. Verse 1, the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. Now, I don't know about you. I hope you have good air conditioning because the last couple of days we've needed it. In the Middle East, one of the things that they did, especially when they had tents like that, is the big flap that was the tent door, they would lift up and it would be a canopy or an awning. Then they would tie that down, and you could sit there outside of the tent in the breeze in the shade. And in this case, he was sitting in the shade near the terebinth trees. So he, Abraham, lifted his eyes, and he looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground and said, "My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that, you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant." And they said, "Do as you said." So Abraham hurried to the tent to Sarah and said quickly, "Make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender, good calf, gave it to the young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So they had veal and bread, unleavened bread probably. Like, what do you call the bread that's challah? Not challah. Naan, right, naan. So unleavened flat bread that you could dip in the gravy of the animal. He gave it to the young man. He hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. So he didn't sit down and eat with them. He stood by them while they ate. So he was hosting them. He was taking care of their needs. He was there making sure their glasses were full, their food was ready, and if they needed anything, he was ready and prepared to provide it. Genesis chapter 19. Later that same day, the 2 angels, because remember the intervening chapter, Abraham talks to the Lord and tries to negotiate down what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. You know, if you find 50 righteous men, will you spare the city? If you find 20, if you find 10. because he's doing his math. Okay, Lot's wife has 2 daughters, 2 sons. How many do I have to get down to in order to save the city? It says in verse 1 of chapter 19, the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself with his face to the ground, just like his uncle Abraham. And he said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night. Wash your feet, and you will rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, we're fine. We'll just spend the night out here in the square." But he insisted strongly, and he had good reason to, because he knew the makeup of the city. He knew what his fellow citizens were like. So he insisted strongly, so they turned into him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast, and he baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Recently I was talking with somebody about this topic, and I mentioned that even King David had a responsibility to be hospitable. Even the pastor has the responsibility to be hospitable. And this person said, "No, you guys are supposed to be taken care of, not having to take care of other people." It's kind of like, well, that's not the way it works. It's interesting. You go through and you read the history of King David. King David had people to his table as a sign of honor and respect for them. Jonathan's son survived Jonathan's death, and King David had Jonathan's son at his table, eating with him perpetually. Notice, please, 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 6. This is the account when the ark is finally coming back from the land of the Philistines, and it's on its way to the tabernacle. And David dances in front of the ark, and his wife disrespects him for him being so glad for something like that. It says in verse 17, this is 1 Samuel chapter 6, verse 17. They brought the ark of the Lord, and they set it in the place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. Then David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. When David had finished offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Then notice the next verse. Then he distributed among the people, among the whole multitude of Israel, 4 or 5 million people. He gave them a portion of meat, a loaf of bread, and a raisin cake. What did it set the king back to do that? To give 4 or 5 million people food. It says, he distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both the men and the women, to everyone a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a cake of raisins. So all the people departed, everyone to his own house. Hospitality is, brethren, showing love to strangers. I'll read one more example Mr. Catherwood tells about. I attended my first Feast of Tabernacles in Big Sandy, Texas in 1957. I had budgeted $35 a day for food for the entire feast. I was somewhat of a skinny kid, but I ate like a horse. And after the first day, fortunately, I received numerous invitations for meals. One day, after early having blown $3 on breakfast, I returned to my tent. Most brethren stayed in tents back then. And it was starting to get late in the day. It was around 6:30 when an older man with an Eastern accent came over and asked me if I'd like to join his family for dinner. I was so very hungry, I said yes instantaneously. He said that they were having chicken, and when we arrived at his tent, I was surprised to see that they had 50 or 60 chickens roasting on spits 10 feet long. The odor of that many chickens roasting simultaneously is absolutely awesome. An all-factory tidal wave. They had wash tubs of salad, a gastronomical delight. They had gallons and gallons of homemade ice cream, the kind that is creamy and smooth. He said, before it was all over, I gained at least 5 pounds. More important, though, I gained precious memories, warm, binding memories, which have bound me to that very first Feast of Tabernacles. I will remember it for eternity. These people were scattered members, and their contact with the brethren in the church was little more than once a year. So they saved all their hospitality money to show it at the Feast of Tabernacles. I waddled back to my tent with my faith that this was really the true Church of God magnified because of the simple social hospitality I enjoyed. Any of you ever experienced something like that? All right, I really like the light, but okay. Right now the light doesn't like me. Okay, don't touch it anymore, Scott. Let's go to Luke chapter 10, please. So we're looking at examples from Scripture. Luke chapter 10. We read this verse often, and we focus on Martha. The fact that Martha was so encumbered with everything, serving and everything else like that. But the fact of the matter is, what she did was the right thing. She just had her focus a little off. Her focus wasn't on her guests necessarily, it was on herself. So please notice, this is Luke chapter 10, starting verse 38. It happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. She had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. Martha was distracted with much serving. So she was doing the right thing in showing hospitality, but she was focused on the serving. And she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you're worried and troubled about many things. One thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, which will not be taken away from her. So Christ did not chide her for serving. He gently chided her for saying, your sister is doing something more important. So, something to think about. Hospitality is showing love to strangers, but it also has to be balanced. Let's go to Acts chapter 2, please. Acts chapter 2, starting in verse 44. Of course, we know Acts chapter 2 is the giving of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, Peter's sermon, the people repenting and being baptized. And then the church grows. Verse 44. Now all who believed were together, and they all had things in common. They sold their possessions and goods and divided them among them, and as everyone had need. So they continued daily with one accord in the temple, breaking bread from house to house. So those people who lived there hosted the people in their homes. Breaking bread from house to house. They ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to the church daily those who are being saved. So they were breaking bread, they were continuing in the doctrine, they were sharing their possessions, they were practicing hospitality to one another. Let's go over to chapter 16, Acts chapter 16. Luke is writing here, Acts chapter 16, verse 14. A certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira who worshiped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, if you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay. So she persuaded us. point number 5. Why is hospitality important to God? Why does God want us to show kindness, to show love to strangers? Why does God want us to have people into our home, to feed them and to entertain them? Because God does that. It's a priority for him because God is love. Showing love in that way is something that God himself does. Please notice Matthew chapter 5. Why is hospitality important to God? Because God is the ultimate host. God is the ultimate lover of strangers. God is the ultimate one who shows kindness and love and takes care of the needs of others. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, of course, is the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, over and over again, Jesus repeatedly says that we have to go above and beyond what the scribes and the Pharisees did. If you only do what they've done, what good is it? You've only done what they do. We are supposed to go above and beyond that. Please notice chapter 5, verse 43. You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be your sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun shine on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Even the tax collectors do that. If you greet your brothers only, what do you do more than others? Even they do that. Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So we are to go above and beyond. God causes the rain to fall on the good and the unjust. God doesn't discriminate and only is kind to the kind people. God takes care of others. Let's go to chapter 14, Matthew chapter 14. Trying to build the case that God the Father and Jesus Christ are hosts. They take care of us. They practice hospitality. It is in their nature, and they want us to do the same thing. A long time ago, I lived in Japan. My father was stationed in Thailand, and we lived in Tokyo. My mom made friends with a man. Actually, she made friends with this man's daughter on a ski trip. Well, this daughter kind of adopted my mom as her older sister. And so the Yakutas invited us to their home. And we lived in Tokyo. We lived in Tachikawa, which was where the huge Air Force base was. And they lived in Tokyo. Well, Mom couldn't come for some reason, so the Yakutas said, send your 2 sons. So my brother and I was 7, Keith was 6. They sent us on the train from Tachikawa to Tokyo. This is back in the 60s. You could do that. We had notes there were safety pinned to our chest saying, please deliver these boys to such and such an address, written in Japanese. And so we got on the train. We went on the train from Tachikawa to Tokyo. And when we got to Tokyo, the Yakutas were there. All the way along the way, all the Japanese students who have to learn English practiced their English on us. Looks like nice weather, huh? Yeah, maybe I'll need an umbrella. But anyway, so Keith and I were entertained by these Japanese students the whole way. As we made our way on the train, I think it was 30 minutes on the train, the Yakutas met us at the station in Tokyo, and the Yakutas owned a Toyota dealership. So they had a house in Tokyo, not far from Tokyo Tower, and so they met us at the train station. We went to their home. They wanted to really treat us nicely. And so they asked, what do you guys like to eat? Well, being typical American boys, we asked for hamburgers. And it's kind of like, okay, So Mr. Yakuda found a McDonald's, I don't know where. We got to the house, and there were 2 cheeseburgers waiting for us. 2 cheeseburgers for me and 1 cheeseburger for my brother. They actually went to the expense to find it. Now, back in the 60s, it wasn't as prevalent as it was now. We got home, and my mom told me, "What did you guys eat? What did they do?" "Oh, we had cheeseburgers." She said, "Do you know how expensive beef is in Japan?" She said those cheeseburgers were probably worth about $13 or $14, and this is back in the 60s, each. So it's like eating filet mignon here, right? These 2 cheeseburgers that these people did. And all they were doing is they were showing kindness to 2 starving little boys because of a family relationship. And to this day, I still remember how kind and generous they were, and they never said anything about the cost of it. And it wasn't until I found out later on what they actually had to sacrifice for us to eat this. If I had realized then, I probably would have eaten it slower, with a lot more appreciation, would have said thank you a lot more sincerely. This is Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, verse 13. Jesus was told something about John the Baptist being beheaded. And it says in verse 13, when he heard it, he departed from there by a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. Now, when it was evening, his disciples came and said, "This is a deserted place. The hour is already late. Send the multitudes away that they may go into the villages and buy for themselves food." And Jesus said, "They don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." You can imagine the look on the disciples' faces. They're saying, there's 5,000 folks. We got nothing. And Jesus said, "You give them something to eat." And they said, "We only have 5 loaves. Now, please understand, these loaves are not foot-longs. They're not 6-foot-longs. They're little sandwich rolls. We're talking about, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus said, "Bring them to me." And he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass. And then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up at heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. So he kept breaking and breaking and breaking and breaking, and every time he broke, it reappeared, and he kept breaking and breaking and breaking and breaking until they had enough food to feed 5,000 people. I can think of a time or two after church, we looked at the potluck and said, well, God's going to have to perform the miracle of the fishes and the loaves to feed this crowd. So they all ate and were filled, and then they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained, and none. And now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So if only half those men were married, you can do the math. I've heard figures of as much as 9,000, depending on how many children there were. Children don't eat as much as adults do, but anyway. So Jesus Christ himself took care of the needs of strangers. Jesus Christ practiced hospitality. God the Father is kind to the just and the unjust. He sends his rain on the good and bad people. In conclusion, hospitality is to show love to others, to share what we have with others. It is closely aligned with fellowship. It is a practice of mature Christians because it is something that our Heavenly Father himself does. Please turn to Psalm 23. Psalm 23, verse 1 says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in need. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Please read verse 5. Who prepares the table? God does. God prepares the table. Now, this morning we had breakfast, and Monica outdid herself. We had waffles, we had sausage, we had bacon, we had blackberries, we had strawberries, we had raspberries, we had kids, we had a table spread. You could feel the corners of the table going, oh, only one, please, okay? She prepared a table before us. Just like Phil Dick had a table prepared before him by the Arab people. Just like Mr. Catherwood had a table prepared before him with chicken and salad and ice cream. Just like this week, somebody took us out to lunch. A table was prepared for us. But who is the one who prepares a table before us? In the presence of my enemies, God the Father. God himself. God and Jesus Christ prepare a table before us in the presence of our enemies. Why is hospitality important? Because God himself is the ultimate host. He takes care of the needs of others. And he commands you and I to do the same.